It was a quiet evening when Dr. Olivia Carter, the director of the FBI's Criminal Investigations Unit, left her office after a long and exhausting day. The weight of national security and law enforcement decisions rested on her shoulders, but tonight she only wanted one thing: peace. Driving her black SUV down a nearly empty road, Olivia sighed in relief. Her thoughts drifted to the book waiting for her at home and the warm cup of tea she planned to enjoy. The flashing city lights dimmed behind her as she entered the quieter suburban area, just minutes from her house. But fate had a different plan for her that night. Suddenly, red and blue lights flooded her rearview mirror. The distant wail of a police siren broke the silence. A police car was signaling her to pull over. Her brows furrowed. Had she done something wrong? No, she had followed every traffic law, speed limit, perfect. Turn signals, used every time. Her car, registered and insured. There was no reason to be stopped. A hint of sarcasm crossed her lips, not from amusement, but frustration. As a black woman in America, she knew these situations could turn ugly, even for someone with her level of power. Not everyone in law enforcement played by the rules. Taking a deep breath, Olivia slowed the SUV and pulled over to the side of the road. Before the officer even approached, she followed the safety precautions ingrained in her for years. She turned on the interior light so the officer could see inside. She placed both hands on the steering wheel in plain sight. She rolled down the window, just enough to speak. Moments later, a tall, white police officer approached her driver's side window. His hand rested on his holster, his expression cold and rigid. His badge read, Officer Greg Dawson. Olivia remained calm. She had faced dangerous criminals, international threats, and high-stakes interrogations. A simple traffic stop shouldn't shake her. "Good evening, officer," she greeted, her voice professional but firm. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" Dawson didn't answer right away. Instead, he squinted at her, as if trying to find something suspicious about her presence. Then, in a flat tone, he said, "License and registration." Olivia tilted her head slightly. No explanation, no mention of a violation. She decided to ask again. "Is there a specific reason for this stop, officer?" Dawson let out a small, annoyed huff before shrugging. "You looked suspicious." Suspicious? Olivia's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. What exactly looked suspicious? Her car? Her face? She kept her expression unreadable. "Suspicious isn't a valid legal reason for a stop, officer. I know my rights." Dawson's jaw clenched, and a flicker of irritation passed over his face. His fingers tapped against the gun holster at his waist. "You arguing with me?" His tone turned sharper. "I gave you an order. Don't make this difficult. Hand over the papers." Olivia exhaled slowly, staying composed. She reached into her glove compartment, retrieving her license and registration, but before handing them over, she held them in her hand for a moment. "I am more than willing to comply," she said, her voice steady. "But as a law enforcement officer myself, I have every right to question an unlawful stop." For a second, Dawson's eyes flickered with something: anger? Challenge? Then in a flash, his palm slammed against the side of her car, making Olivia's pulse spike for a brief moment. "Don't start lecturing me about the law," he snapped. "I am the law here. You're just another—" He stopped himself. Just another what? Olivia wondered. The moment was charged, the air thick with tension. Other cars passed by, but no one slowed down, no one stopped. She forced herself to stay calm. This was not the first time she had seen abuse of power. But this time, it was happening to her. And she had a feeling this wasn't over yet. Olivia remained still, her heart steady but her mind sharp. She had dealt with high-profile criminals, corrupt officials, and even undercover operations. But this, a routine traffic stop escalating into something more, felt different. Officer Greg Dawson's face was hardened with hostility. His hand hovered dangerously close to his gun, his stance wide, as if preparing for a confrontation. She refused to be intimidated. Still holding her license and registration, she met his gaze. "Officer, I will ask you one more time. Why am I being stopped?" Dawson scoffed. "I don't need to explain myself to you. I tell you what to do, and you do it." His words carried a sharp edge, one that Olivia recognized well. This wasn't about law enforcement. This was about control. She took a slow, measured breath. Stay calm, stay professional. "I am more than willing to comply with a lawful order," she repeated, her voice steady. "But I need to know if there's a legitimate reason for this stop. If there is none, then—" Dawson took a sudden step forward, his chest inches from her open window. "I don't give explanations to people like you." Olivia's grip tightened around the steering wheel. She had heard those words before. People like you? A flicker of cold anger stirred inside her, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she remained composed, her expression unreadable. "People like me?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Dawson smirked, but there was no amusement in it. "You heard me." A moment of silence passed between them, thick with unspoken words. Olivia knew exactly what was happening. He had no reason to stop her, and he knew it. But instead of admitting it, he wanted to flex his authority, wanted to see if she would submit, if she would shrink under pressure. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She slowly lifted her phone from its holder on the dashboard, making sure every movement was deliberate and visible. "Just so we're clear," she said, tapping the screen, "this entire interaction is being recorded." Dawson's face twitched. His fingers brushed against his holster again. "You think that scares me?" he sneered. Olivia didn't flinch. "I don't need you to be scared," she said. "I just need you to follow the law." For a second, she thought she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. But then, his patience snapped, his voice turned sharp. "Step out of the car, now!" Olivia's stomach dropped slightly. This was escalating too fast. She knew the unwritten rules, the dangerous line she was walking. If she refused, he could claim she was resisting. If she complied, she would be vulnerable outside the vehicle. Either way, this wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. She raised an eyebrow. "Under what grounds?" Dawson's jaw clenched. He didn't like being questioned, didn't like losing control. "Because I said so," he snapped. She let out a slow breath, glancing at her phone screen. The red light was still blinking. The recording was still running. "Officer Dawson," she said carefully, "I do not feel safe stepping out of my vehicle without a lawful reason. If you cannot provide one, I will remain seated." That was it. That was the moment his composure cracked entirely. His hand flew to his gun. He drew his weapon. The cold, metallic barrel of the gun pointed directly at her. "I said get out of the car." Silence. A deadly, suffocating silence. Olivia's body went still, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had seen this happen before. She had investigated cases like this. But never, never did she expect to have a gun aimed at her during a routine traffic stop. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. She knew that one wrong move, one wrong word, could be fatal. She had to think fast. This was no longer about words. This was survival. The cold steel of Officer Dawson's gun glinted under the dim glow of the streetlights. Its barrel pointed directly at Olivia's head. The world outside the SUV felt eerily distant. Cars passed by, their drivers unaware that in this moment her life hung in the balance. Inside, the air was thick with tension. A single movement, a single misunderstanding could turn deadly. Olivia stayed completely still, her hands gripping the steering wheel, visible, steady, controlled. She had trained hundreds of agents to stay calm under pressure, but nothing compared to having a loaded gun aimed at your face by someone who was supposed to uphold the law. Dawson's breathing was sharp, his grip on the weapon firm. "I won't say it again," he growled. "Get outside office the car." But Olivia saw something else in his eyes, something beyond anger. It was desperation. He had escalated too far, too fast. He knew it, and now he was doubling down instead of backing off. Olivia had seen this behavior before, in criminals cornered with no way out, and she knew how dangerous that made him. She took a slow, measured breath. "Officer Dawson," she said evenly without moving an inch, "you are currently aiming a deadly weapon at an unarmed citizen who has not posed a threat." Her voice was firm, but not challenging. She needed to de-escalate this. Dawson didn't lower his gun. If anything, his grip tightened. "You think you're in charge here?" he hissed. "You think your little badge means something?" That's when it hit her. He knew exactly who she was, but it didn't matter to him. Her FBI title, her authority, none of it mattered because to him she was just another black person who needed to be put in their place. She felt a surge of cold, quiet anger. But anger wouldn't save her life. Logic would. Her phone was still recording. That red blinking light in the corner of the screen was her lifeline. She kept her gaze steady. "Officer Dawson, this interaction is being recorded and streamed live. My office is watching. They know exactly what's happening." Dawson's eyes flickered. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into his expression. "You're bluffing," he snapped. Olivia didn't blink. "Am I?" She saw it. The slight hesitation in his grip, the twitch in his fingers. He was reconsidering. The moment hung in the air, stretched thin like a wire about to snap. Then a voice shattered the silence. Sirens, loud, approaching fast. Bright headlights flooded the road behind them, and Olivia felt a wave of relief as another police vehicle pulled up fast. The door slammed open. A stern, authoritative voice boomed through the night. "Dawson, stand down!" Dawson froze. For a second his gun wavered. Then slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the weapon. Olivia finally exhaled. The situation had changed, and Dawson was no longer in control. As Officer Dawson lowered his gun, his face paled under the flashing police lights. The new squad car had barely come to a stop when two officers jumped out, their hands instinctively hovering over their holsters. A towering man in a sheriff's uniform stepped forward, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Dawson, what the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice cut through the night like a blade. Dawson hesitated, his jaw clenching. "Sir, she was resisting." "Resisting?" The sheriff's voice was sharp. "I just got a call from the FBI director's office. They've been watching this entire stop in real time. You pulled a gun on the director of the FBI." Dawson's eyes widened for a split second. Reality was crashing down on him. The sheriff turned toward Olivia, who was still seated in her car, her hands steady on the wheel. "Mom, are you all right?" Olivia nodded, her voice calm but firm. "I will be once this officer is disarmed and taken off duty." The sheriff didn't hesitate. He turned back to Dawson. "Hand over your weapon, now." Dawson looked around as if searching for an escape. His breathing was ragged, his fingers twitching. For a split second, Olivia wondered if he might actually try to resist. But then, under the weight of staring eyes and blaring sirens, he cracked. His shoulders slumped, and with clear reluctance, he unbuckled his holster and handed his gun to the sheriff. The moment was dead silent. One of the other officers stepped forward. "Sir, I think we should place him under arrest." Dawson spun around, his face twisting in anger. "You're arresting me? For what? I was doing my job." The sheriff didn't even blink. "You abused your power, you unlawfully detained a citizen, and you drew a gun on the director of the FBI without cause." Dawson stared at him, his face a mix of rage and disbelief. Then his gaze turned toward Olivia, cold, furious. "You set me up," he muttered. Olivia met his glare without flinching. "No, Officer Dawson, you did this to yourself." The sheriff gestured to his officers. "Cuff him, now!" The officers moved in. For the first time in his career, Greg Dawson felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around his wrists. His own colleagues were leading him away, his badge stripped from his uniform. Olivia finally took a deep breath. Justice had only just begun. But this night was far from over. As Officer Dawson was led away in handcuffs, his face burned with humiliation and rage. He struggled against the officers gripping his arms, but didn't resist enough to make things worse for himself. "This is a mistake," he spat. "You're ruining a good cop's career over nothing." The sheriff's expression remained cold. "You ruined your own career, Dawson." Olivia stepped out of her SUV, standing tall, her presence commanding. She had spent years upholding the law, fighting against corruption, and ensuring that justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. Tonight, she had become a living example of why reform was still necessary. She turned toward the sheriff. "I assume there will be a full investigation?" The sheriff nodded, rubbing his temple as if the weight of the situation had just sunk in. "Yes, ma'am, but I doubt we'll need much more evidence. Your video alone is enough to convict him." Olivia held up her phone, the recording still active. The red light blinked steadily, capturing everything. "I'll be submitting this to my office," she said. "The Department of Justice will also be notified." Dawson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "So, this is how it is, huh? You get to ruin me because you're in a position of power?" Olivia's expression remained unshaken. "You should know, Officer Dawson," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "Power doesn't protect people like me." Dawson stopped laughing. For the first time, his eyes flickered with something other than anger. A realization. A truth he had never considered. But it was too late. The officers pushed him toward the squad car, opening the door. Before stepping in, he turned back to Olivia. "This isn't over," he muttered. She didn't react. She had heard threats before. The car door slammed shut, and Dawson was driven away, not as a cop, but as a man facing the very system he had abused. The sheriff turned to Olivia. "Ma'am, do you need a formal escort home?" She shook her head. "I can handle myself." He nodded, but his brows were furrowed with concern. "You know this is going to be all over the news by morning, right?" he said. "An FBI director being held at gunpoint by a local cop. It's not something the public is going to ignore." Olivia sighed, glancing at her phone screen, which had dozens of missed calls and notifications. Her office, her agents, the media, the storm was already brewing. She met the sheriff's gaze. "Good," she said. "It's time people saw the truth." She opened her car door, slid into the driver's seat, and took one last look in the rearview mirror. The flashing lights, the officers, the weight of what had just happened, it would stay with her for a long time. But one thing was certain. Dawson thought he was the one in control tonight. He was wrong. By the time Olivia Carter pulled into her driveway, her phone was buzzing non-stop. Emails, calls, and messages flooded in, from her office, from the media, from legal teams preparing for what was coming next. She leaned back in her seat, taking a deep breath. What happened tonight was bigger than just her. It was about every person who had ever been unfairly stopped, threatened, or mistreated by the very system meant to protect them. And now, the world was watching. By morning, the story had exploded across news outlets. FBI director pulled over and held at gunpoint by local officer. Abuse of power, officer arrested after threatening high-ranking federal official. Justice, system under fire after racially charged traffic stop. The video recording from Olivia's phone had been formally submitted to the FBI and the Department of Justice. Within hours, a full internal investigation had been launched against Officer Greg Dawson. But there was no debate about what happened. His actions were caught on camera, his tone, his threats, his abuse of power, his gun aimed at an unarmed citizen. There was no justifying it. 2 months later, Dawson stood in court, no longer in uniform, no longer holding a badge, just another defendant facing justice. His lawyer argued that the situation had been a misunderstanding, that he had acted out of fear and caution. But the prosecution had the video. The jury watched as Dawson's gun was raised, as his words dripped with bias and aggression. The courtroom was silent. Then it was Olivia's turn to speak. She stood at the witness stand, her voice calm but unshakable. "This is not just about me," she said, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. "This is about a system that has allowed officers like Greg Dawson to believe they are untouchable, to believe that they can pull a gun on an innocent person and get away with it." Dawson kept his head down. He knew. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before delivering the verdict. Check, mark, guilty. He was convicted on multiple charges: abuse of power, unlawful detainment, reckless endangerment, and violation of civil rights. His sentence: years behind bars. As the judge read the final verdict, the courtroom was dead silent. For the first time since the night of the traffic stop, Dawson had nothing to say because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Olivia for a statement. She held her ground, her voice strong. "This was never about revenge," she said. "This was about accountability." She looked at the cameras. "This was about justice." And with that, she turned away, walking toward a future where officers like Dawson would think twice before abusing their power. Because now the world knew, and justice had spoken. As Olivia Carter walked away from the courthouse, justice had been served, but the fight for fairness and accountability was far from over. Stories like this happen every day, but not everyone has the power to fight back. That's why it's so important to stand up for truth, justice, and equal treatment under the law. What are your thoughts on this case? Have you, or someone you know, ever faced an unfair situation like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe in justice, accountability, and the need for real change in our legal system, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story. Because tomorrow we'll be bringing you another meaningful story that deserves to be heard. Justice starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay informed, and see you in the next story.